We're discussing Tuesday's election results, and joining us now are Mark Jones, political science fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and Renee Cross, senior director at the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Morning, Craig.
Let's start where I started with Andrew and Michael with the U.S. Senate results. As I noted, polling up to a month ago found Crockett ahead of Talarico. He garnered a ton of publicity and money, as Andrew was describing, when Stephen Colbert went on The Late Show and said they couldn't air his interview with Talarico based on a warning from CBS attorneys having to do with their interpretation of what the FCC chairman was suggesting. It was one of those. CBS disputed Colbert's characterization, but the interview went on YouTube, garnered millions of views. Talarico raised millions of dollars, blitzed the airwaves and the internet with ads. Is Stephen Colbert responsible for James Talarico's victory?
I wouldn't say he's responsible, but I think it does highlight something that occurs in primaries, especially when you have two very well-liked candidates like Talarico and Crockett, who Democratic voters almost unanimously liked. There's no anchor like in a partisan election in November where you have Republicans generally voting Republicans and Democrats generally voting for Democrats. In this case, they liked both candidates and they were trying to decide which candidate was best, which one gave them the best hope of beating Republicans in the fall. And at the end of the day, things like the Colbert incident, the fundraising that Talarico had off of that was really positive. I think this is also an example of campaigns matter. James Talarico ran a fantastic campaign. He was always out there doing public events. He was on TV. He was using social media effectively. In a really strong organization. Whereas the Crockett campaign didn't seem to have much of a campaign organization for its first month or two, and even during the final weeks, it had sort of a substandard, ineffective campaign, and that really ended up costing her, I think.
One thing just an observation that I noted about the ads that both candidates were using, and this is not all of the ads, but the preponderance of them, it seemed that the ones, and I'm not talking about outside groups here, I'm talking about the ads from the campaigns themselves. The ones from Talarico's campaign, by and large, showed him speaking either to the camera or to crowds of people and making his case. The ones from Crockett's campaign primarily, and maybe I'm wrong on this observation, but this is what I seem to perceive, were other voices, a voiceover, somebody talking about her, showing her, but not hearing her voice, her making her case, not her direct to camera.
Well, I think Talarico certainly was playing to his strength, right? I mean, he is a charismatic speaker, so the campaign made a really good decision there. Now, could Crockett have done better if she would have taken that approach? Maybe so. Enough to make the difference? No, I don't think so.
On the Republican side, what are your takeaways from how close the results were between Cornyn and Paxton?
Well, we anticipated that would be the two frontrunners and that would go to a runoff. However, most polls had Paxton ahead, so Cornyn was able to, make that final push. But keep in mind, he alone spent $71 million.
Wow.
And Paxton spent $4.4 million. So huge difference. So those votes cost a lot for Cornyn.
Where are Wesley Hunt's votes going?
Well, that's a good question. I think some of them will stay home. When we did polling on it, we saw that a little more of them went towards Paxton than to Cornyn. But I think some of those people already made the decision prior to the vote instead of voting for Wesley Hunt as they had intended originally. Once it was clear that he was not going to be really competitive, they already made their decision. This was a really good result for Senator Cornyn. He'll be able to make a very compelling case to President Donald Trump that he is just as popular with Republican primary voters as Ken Paxton is, and actually a little more. And with Talarico as the Democratic nominee and with all of the enthusiasm that Democrats have in Texas, that having a weak candidate like Ken Paxton run in November could potentially cost Republicans that Senate seat and have a whole down ballot effect that affects other races where Republicans may be facing strong headwinds.
Here in the Houston area, as we have been parsing in real time, and you were probably laughing in the hallway listening to Congressman Christian Menefee and Al Green, it appears, are indeed headed to a runoff in the 18th Congressional District. Are you surprised?
I am somewhat surprised. I mean, we certainly saw from our polling that Christian Menefee would pull this out. However, District 18 has been in a very peculiar place in terms of elections in the last 2 years. So at this point, I mean, we shall see. And the runoff is a whole separate election.
Right, and the runoff on the Democratic side is going to be dramatically different than on the Republican side. Republican side, you still have the Senate race as well as an Attorney General race driving turnout. On the Democratic side, you won't have that U.S. Senate race driving turnout. You maybe will have an Attorney General race and a Lieutenant Governor race that nobody's really following. So turnout's going to plummet dramatically, and we'll see which of the two candidates, Menefee or Green, is able to bring their supporters out. One thing was impressive that Green, I think, did is he hadn't had to campaign for over 20 years since when he defeated Chris Bell. But this time around, he was able to essentially go from being in neutral to fourth gear relatively quickly, and I think push or pull Menefee down enough and raise himself up enough that he was able to force the runoff. Also surprising was the fact that although during the entire early voting period and election day period, Amanda Edwards had signaled that she was no longer campaigning, she still won about 7% of the vote.
I think the county race, too, could make a difference in CD 18's turnout for the runoff, because we do have a competitive county judge race.
Mark, in the 2nd District, Congressman Dan Crenshaw lost his primary to State Representative Steve Toth. What does it say to you about the direction of the Republican Party in recent years that Crenshaw was either seen as not conservative enough or not supportive enough of President Trump?
Well, I think it shows where the Republican Party in Texas is today. It's very supportive of Donald Trump. About 9 out of 10 Republican primary voters have a favorable opinion of the president. And clearly, Dan Crenshaw is not on President Trump's good side. While the president didn't endorse State Representative Steve Toth, he also did not endorse Dan Crenshaw, despite endorsing pretty much every other Republican incumbent. Crenshaw marched to the beat of his own drum. He often was seen as a sort of prickly person or somebody who believed that he was the smartest person in the room. Sometimes he was, but often people don't like that. So he rubbed a lot of people in the Republican circles here in Harris County and in Montgomery County the wrong way. This time around, you had Toth launch a good campaign. There are a couple of deep-pocketed donors from Montgomery County who backed his campaign. And not only did he defeat Crenshaw, he beat him pretty handily.
Renee, in the 9th District, as we heard from Andrew Schneider, Briscoe Cain and Alex Mealer are headed to a runoff in large part because Steve Stockman garnered so much of the vote. Are you surprised by that?
Somewhat. However, even though Briscoe Cain is from that area, people are, at least some of the older voters, which of course turn out in high numbers, they're familiar with the Stockman name. So the fact that he is third is not surprising. That he did as well as he did is surprising.
Mark, what are your takeaways from the Harris County judges' races, both heading to runoffs?
Well, on the Republican side, and I think one of the issues with these races is none of the candidates, either on the Republican or Democratic side, really did a blast in terms of media and in terms of campaigning. They were pretty low-key campaigns. And they're buried way down on the ballot. You had a lot of people get there and often not know who these candidates were, so you tend to see things a little more fragmented. For instance, Matt Salazar on the Democratic side did not run much of a campaign, yet he received about 16% of the vote. On the Republican side, what's his name? Is it Warren Howell?
Yes.
Warren Howell. Ran a good campaign at the end, some targeted direct mail as well as text messaging, and so it looks like he'll barely narrow out, beat out Marty Lancton for a spot in the runoff. Both of them will be going to runoffs. That will probably be the focal point here in Houston in terms of, in addition to these congressional races, these Republican and Democratic runoffs.
Renee, of the statewide results, what intrigued you most Tuesday?
I guess on the statewide, certainly the battle between the endorsements by Trump and Abbott, and we saw them play out differently, right? Trump won one, and Abbott won the other.
Specifically, Sid Miller out as agriculture commissioner, that one certainly stands out.
Right. Against Abbott endorsed Nate Sheets. I think statewide, I would also put the Attorney General race on the Republican side in the column of very interesting. You know, early on, Chip Roy had a really good lead, early polling. He's finished second. And at one point last night, it almost looked like Mays Middleton was going to win it outright. So that'll be an interesting runoff to watch.
Can we glean anything from voter turnout Tuesday to tell us whether any statewide offices may actually be susceptible to a flip to Democrats in November?
I mean, at the end of the day, turnout ended up actually being pretty close. Democrats will have the advantage by probably about 100,000 votes, maybe 200,000, but I think we can say that there is more enthusiasm on the Democratic side than in past cycles when there was relatively limited enthusiasm. But there's probably not, we don't want to read too much into this as we approach November. That's a long way away. And at the end of the day, we're still looking at an electorate that was probably about 1 in 4, a little more than 1 in 4 of actual registered voters. But there's clearly high levels of Democratic enthusiasm. And when you look down on the border and in some of the congressional districts that were redistricted to potentially elect a Republican, there you saw Latino turnout pretty dramatically higher than our Latino turnout on the Democratic side, dramatically higher than on the Republican side. And that's good news for, say, Democratic Congressman Henry Cuellar in Laredo and Democratic Congressman Vicente Gonzalez in Brownsville, both of whom are targeted by this, but they look to be pretty secure.
Renee, there are some obvious issues that we've known all along were going to have an impact on voters. The economy, immigration, certainly high on the list. What about the war in Iran? Did that have any impact on how people voted yesterday?
It could have, but I don't think, since so many people had already voted, I think the impact would probably be minimal. Now, if it has an impact in November, that just depends on how long this goes on.
Yeah, and that seems very unclear, Mark. Congress is expected to hold a vote tomorrow over the authorization of force in Iran. Hasn't that horse left the barn?
The U.S. is actively engaged in a war against Iran. We had the sinking of an Iranian destroyer off the coast of Sri Lanka by a U.S. submarine that was outcome. I think it was coming back from a set of war games in India. So this is a full-blown war. It's even actually putting in doubt whether the Iranian soccer team will actually come to the World Cup in the United States this summer, given the hostilities.
What do you expect to be the result of Thursday's vote?
I think it's going to be business as usual. We're going to continue to hear the Republicans have differing opinions on why we are even in this. Democrats are going to continue to use this as an issue, but I don't see anything changing by the vote.
No, I mean, it would only be symbolic if somehow Democrats were able to get a majority vote, but it's not going to be nearly veto. It's not going to be high enough to essentially sustain a veto, so it's not going to have any practical effect on this. And at the end of the day, we don't really know how much longer President Trump wants to continue this conflict. At a certain point, it's going to start to jeopardize November elections. If we see impact on oil prices, if we see a rising U.S. deaths, if we see the global economy start to go into a tailspin, all of that, if it occurs, is going to impact on Republicans and President Trump.
Those two of those first three things have kind of already happened.
Right, but the question is, will they occur in a deeper perspective? Right now, the oil prices haven't really hit home yet. They've hit on the spot market somewhat, but they aren't baked yet in terms of overall business planning. If it looks like we're going to have these prices for the foreseeable future, that's a completely different ballgame.
Briefly, just one other thing I wanted to bring up. The U.S. Supreme Court Monday intervened in New York's redistricting battle. Still talking about elections in a way anyway here. What did the high court say, and why did they intervene here and not in other states?
Well, in this case, it was about whether the district was constitutionally drawn or not, and what New York wanted to do was to redraw a Republican-leaning district based on a Voting Rights Act argument, and the Supreme Court said no. This is a win for Republicans because it keeps a district that leans Republican, leaning Republican, whereas if the Democrats in New York had their way, this would be one more seat that would flip to the Democratic Party.
You can read so much more about Tuesday's election at houstonpublicmedia.org, and we'll have continuing coverage throughout the day, including on the Texas Standard at 10 o'clock. I mentioned Andrew Schneider's going to be on that. Mark Jones will be on there as well. Mark is a political science fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Renee Cross is senior director of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Craig.